Great question. The past trauma really goes back to what you asked about childhood trauma, James, and thinking about if we have something happen. So imagine, I always say, and this is probably good, I have a grapefruit, so I'm a visual person. So imagine here, this is the initial event, right? There was an initial event that happened. And when those emotions have not been dealt with and they had been negative, we just kind of hide it, right? Almost like the inside of the fruit is all those emotions, and we kind of hide it over. And what happens is if we don't deal with it, it's just like thinking about a soda with all the stuff in it. If we don't deal with it, it's ready to bubble and burst out. But we learn how to stuff it down, or we learn how to do something, or our brain just automatically, because it's too much, shuts it down. And so what happens then is if we actually don't deal with the emotions or identify the emotions, and so from an event, let's say, for example, from this event, someone said something horrible to me, right? Or somebody made fun of me and there was bullying. If that hasn't been dealt with, I have a negative belief that I'm horrible or I'm terrible or I'm no good. I believe that. And then every time another event happens, just think of a chain event. Every time another event happens, another link goes on and the emotions get heightened. So as I get older, something that might happen where someone says something to me that isn't a negative thing, I might perceive it, and all of a sudden I go off because my emotions have never been dealt with, and the more heightened emotions and the more I haven't dealt with it, it'll actually impact my interactions. It'll impact my then outbursts or how I feel about myself.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. You are listening to Don't Be Afraid to Talk podcast with James. I believe if we are going to affect change, we must go back to the basic, which for me, in essence, is conversations. Talking and listening is key for growth, and I hope our stories will bring us together and we can draw inspiration from each other. Conversation will include topics such as mental and physical health, trauma and its effect, suicidal thoughts, recovery, and well-being. We will continue to raise awareness and offer a different perspective, a mindset or an idea that could inspire you to take charge of your well-being and to grow as a human being. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Ask the Therapist. Today I'm joined by Dr. Amanda, who's an author, an educator, consultant, and also an international conference speaker. And today we're going to be discussing complex trauma. If you're listening today, have an open mind, and we hope you can learn something from this episode. Amanda, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, James? Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. So much to learn today, so I'm excited. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Amanda Helman. As James mentioned, I am a coach, a breakthrough coach, and I work with people to unpack anything that is preventing them from moving ahead in their life and finding their voice and using their voice. And I'm a passionate educator, and I'm really passionate about trauma and helping people in the area of mental health as well. So that is a little bit about me.
Yeah, fantastic. Where are you based again? Sorry.
I live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in the United States.
Yeah. Brilliant. Before we get going, we're just going to play a quick 1-for-1 game. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a word, and you say the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay. 5 words. Okay. So, the first one is swimming.
Pool.
Mexican food.
Guacamole.
Halloween.
Candy.
Memories.
Family.
And the last one is identity.
Golden.
Sweet. That's it. Simple.
I think the biggest one was memories. I was like, but that was fun. I liked it.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So I just like to start with that. And today we're going to be talking all things complex trauma. So we get going. Quite a lot to go through today. So, yeah. And I will start with my first question, which is quite broad. So, what is complex trauma?
Sure. And complex trauma, James, essentially trauma, if we just unpack that first, an acute trauma is one event that may have impacted our physiological, emotional, and physical and every area of our life well-being. And it can impact our memories or even how we think of ourselves or others, and can really impact our perceptions of ourselves or others. And those memories can impact other areas of our life when those memories come up. Complex trauma is a little different in that it is still a trauma, but it's many events that may happen on one given day. For example, sexual trauma, physical trauma, emotional abuse. It could be witnessing accidents, medical traumas, death, and it can happen over a long period of time. So it may be a week or months or years, where if it's something where it happened in childhood or family, right, that has not been dealt with, it's an ongoing trauma. And the complexity of that is that there's unpacking a lot of painful memories and emotions that have happened because of an event that impacts our identity, essentially our emotional, physical, I even say sexual identity, you name it, all parts of our whole being, including spiritual. And so trauma matters no matter if it's one trauma or many. However, complex trauma really impacts the psyche, and that you're unpacking a lot because it's happened so many times that it really does take some additional work to go through.
Okay. So with complex trauma as to acute trauma, it's not one event.
Yes.
This is something that probably happened over a period of time, and you're trying to unpack that so there could be, it's
a lot more. Mm-hmm.
Okay, brilliant. My next question is, what are the long-term effects of childhood trauma?
Childhood trauma does have lasting impact. There have been studies, James, that show the brain, and it's really fascinating, for children who've had ongoing abuse when they're younger. They actually have fMRI brain scans, and it shows that there was a difference in the brain. A lot of times ADHD, which is attention hyperactivity deficit disorder, sometimes people are diagnosed with ADHD, but it's actually trauma. And what happens though is that we call something resilience, whereas in childhood, we're too young to understand the violations that happened. It's something that we never expected because we wanted to have safety in our family and the people that are supposed to be around us. And what happens is our brain protects us by hiding that. And often there may be behaviors or things that happen or seep out over time. But childhood trauma can lead to children feeling like they're not good enough. They may have shame, resentment, abandonment, and they may end up almost hiding who they are, just hiding into themselves. And so even though there are children that may get support, what happens is that if we don't deal with the childhood trauma early, it can impact our life later, such as anxiety, depression, shame, impacting our social relationships, our worth and how we value ourselves, as well as even our relationships with others and what we perceive about how others think about us. So there are a lot of different impacts, including even our education, our academics, and even perhaps our post-high school, our outcomes, in life if it's not dealt with. And so childhood trauma definitely can impact a lot of our beliefs, a lot of who we are. And we're finding out now, I believe, that if we can help support people earlier, then yes, we have a healing journey. We're humans. Things happen in our life that we don't expect. But if we can help our children early, then we can prevent perhaps the really deep seated, I believe, mental health things that come up later in life that never got dealt with.
Like in your 30s, things will start coming up.
40s, 50s, when you try to hide it, you can't really hide, you can only do so much. But the body, Bessel van der Kolk, he wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score, one of my favorite books, and it's true. Our brain and body might be disconnected, but our body remembers. And so when we're starting to have a lot more physical health things, it's really because the emotional health is saying, hey, alert, alert, there's some things that haven't been dealt with. And so at some point our body does always keep score, and it's really that at that time where we're saying, okay, something's going on, and hopefully we can then address it.
And do you think ADHD diagnosis, especially with children, some of it could be trauma, but they're being diagnosed with ADHD.
Yes, there's actually talk and discussion even in the counseling fields and education that there's some overlap between ADHD and trauma. However, there are very vast differences, but there are some things that are similar. But the big thing is we're finding that ADHD is not always just ADHD. There's been times where it was misdiagnosed because, again, of not having trauma-informed practices, of understanding what are some of our children's backgrounds, or getting some of that information and really understanding how that impacts the brain, how that impacts academics, and how that impacts the executive functions that we have, such as time management, or ability to sustain attention, or planning and organization, and how that impacts those different functions when we've had things happen.
So without having the trauma-informed information, so for a child, say 7-year-old child, who is, we say, misbehaving, but they're not misbehaving. So they might be diagnosed with a condition, but below that condition, there's something that's happening that we're not looking at.
Yeah, it could be. And again, it could be both, and sometimes not. However, I'm from the viewpoint that every single family, we're all humans, and there's a lot of generational trauma that happens where there's secret things that have happened in our family lines that lead to higher things of anxiety or depression or changes in our brain. And I believe that if they're not dealt with, not only do we have our individual trauma, but we also have the family trauma that we haven't dealt with that has impacted us and our belief systems and how we move. And so that's also part of it. So I actually believe that children who may have some of those different things going on, it may not just be what's going on with them. It may just be what's going on that impacted the family.
And then the child is just picking it up picking up what the parent hadn't dealt with. Yeah, it's scary. My next question is, why does my past trauma still affect me?
Great question. The past trauma, it really goes back to what you asked about childhood trauma, James, and thinking about if we have something happen. So imagine, I always say, and this is probably good, I have a grapefruit, so I'm a visual person. So imagine here, this is the initial event, right? There was an initial event that happened. And when those emotions have not been dealt with and they had been negative, we just kind of hide it. Right? Almost like the inside of the fruit is all those emotions, and we kind of hide it over. And what happens is if we don't deal with it, it's just like thinking about a soda with all the stuff in it. If we don't deal with it, it's ready to bubble and burst out. But we learn how to stuff it down, or we learn how to do something, or our brain just automatically, because it's too much, shuts it down. And so what happens then is if we actually don't deal with the emotions or identify the emotions, and so from an event, let's say, for example, from this event, someone said something horrible to me, right? Or somebody made fun of me and there was bullying. If that hasn't been dealt with, I have a negative belief that I'm horrible or I'm terrible or I'm no good. I believe that. And then every time another event happens, just think of a chain event. Every time another event happens, another link goes on and the emotions get heightened. So as I get older, something that might happen where someone says something to me that isn't a negative thing, I might perceive it, and all of a sudden I go off because my emotions have never been dealt with, and the more heightened emotions and the more I haven't dealt with it, it'll actually impact my interactions. It'll impact my then outbursts or how I feel about myself. And so that past trauma, if not dealt with, can actually impact my emotions. And so my responses may change until we get to the root of it. Once we get to the root of it, it's just like a chain. And one of my good mentors, Craig Miller, says, once you get to the root of it, all the chains fall. And then when you have things, you may still have emotions, but it's not the heightened ones that you had before.
So say someone in their 30s, or 30s, for example, that had a trauma event that they've been suppressing. We just say with alcohol because it's easier.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And eventually your body will your body's constantly trying to get your attention to deal with that emotion. So is that why people say they reach a certain age and they break down? Because they can no longer satisfy what they're trying to hide with the substance that they're using.
a great way to explain that, James. Actually, I would,
Okay.
I would agree with you that self-protection of any kinds, this is great for skin, right? We don't want to eat the skin, but a lot of times this is what self-protection barriers. It could be all kinds of stuff. I actually talked a little bit about this yesterday, but it could be just in one of my groups, but basically the self-protection could be alcohol, drugs, food, whatever it is. Humor. I mean, humor can be good. It's good to have joy, but we can actually use humor to deflect how we're actually feeling. And so there's so many different avenues that we can use for self-protection that really deflect some of those emotions and then once we keep doing this at some point, because it is self-harm. I always say is the self-protection is self-harm. That was something that was a revelation to me. And at some point, as we're in our love journey or healing journey, it's like, okay, this isn't serving me. There's something different that's happening, but we keep going from one thing to another because it's so painful to go to the initial violation. So yeah, I would say that what you're talking about, like alcohol or addiction, it really is. And again, there are some addictions that, yes, like if we pick it up, it might not be from trauma, but a lot of the different things can tend to be something where we're numbing a pain or numbing something, especially if there's a trauma background for a person.
That's when things get really excited. Yeah. My next question is, how can complex trauma affect on child's development?
So complex trauma can certainly impact the child's development in their brain. It can their thinking. For example, some students, it might lead to them shutting down with talking, speech. It can impact even their interactions at school, social development with peers. So a lot of times if children are, again, they may be exhibiting some more sexualized behavior, or again, you might see students that have more higher behaviors that are happening because they don't know how to express, they don't have the language to say, this is what happened to me. And childhood development, there has been research that's shown that if there has been trauma, it can impact our development in not just academics, behavior, socially, and it can just impact, again, how we view ourselves. So you might have children shutting down or children that may view themselves as bad, or even a lot more anxiety or depression. And even some of the things, unfortunately, for children or youth, if it's not addressed, because there's silences in families or there's silences in society or communities and we don't pick up on the trauma, it can really impact the child in that you might see a higher risk of suicide ideation or suicide attempts. We know that for youth, there's a lot more of that if we're not checking in with mental health.
And when we're talking about child development, do you think the trauma starts way before birth?
Oh, that's okay. So in terms of that, okay, so that's some of it like during, but I actually believe, yes, trauma can begin in the womb. And in fact, it can really begin with the generation prior. If you think about our families, our mom and dads come together, and everything they bring. And if it hasn't been dealt with, that obviously makes the child in the womb. And I have, in fact, again, there's research for anxiety. It's not to blame or shame moms or family, but
no, we're not blaming anyone.
Right. That, I always want to say that because sometimes if people are in here and your moms or your family, it's not about blame or shame. It's just looking at it and saying, okay, now we know, now we can continue to be aware of it. And so in research, it shows that with moms, if they have high anxiety and it hasn't been addressed, it actually can impact their babies in the womb. And it's cortisol. It's cortisol that can impact the babies. Now that's, again, I want to say not blaming or shaming, but we are finding that in research that higher levels can impact the baby who may have anxiety. Now that's examples of how research is showing that there can be, it's validating what we're finding about the anxiety. Now, in terms of before the womb, that's where I'm saying that if we have emotions or even these high cortisol levels or emotions that are impacting our neurotransmitters, which are part of our brain, all the activations in us, if that's happening, then we're having the impact on our body physiologically, and mom and dad, whatever they didn't deal with, I call it trauma, imprints or really cellular memory trauma, that then happens in the baby Again, as they grow up, they may have some of that. So when you hear people say, oh, they're just like your mom or dad, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like we have families, but what happens is that's part of that memory trauma. If we haven't dealt with it, then the individual child, they have their experiences plus all of, not just mom and dad, but anything that happened in the family line that hasn't been addressed, that impacts that child as well. So yes, answering your question, childhood trauma in my experiences and even what I've healed from and even where I went back to the womb in some of my healing. I actually saw myself in the womb and I actually had a lot of healing there. And I've had a lot of clients actually go back to the womb and that's helped them shift from that high anxiety. And so I can speak from some of my own experiences and some from some of the people I've coached that they end up going back to the womb. And it's really fascinating that at some point they will go back there because that is the place where I believe trauma can be greatly impacted if it's not addressed and even outside of the womb.
So even if you're born with high anxiety, but you don't know, you can obviously overcome that, can't you? Like, I know they say it's in your gene, but...
Yeah, I think, there's different skills out there again, right? There's different places where it's like, okay, you can manage anxiety. I believe that in my lifetime that there's a time and place for managing anxiety, and there's a time and place where you actually can decrease it. And in fact, it can be almost eradicated. Now, there's healthy anxiety that can happen, right? Like meaning healthy stress, not necessarily healthy anxiety. But I actually believe in life, we're going to have things that might happen that can, impact us where we're like, whoa, this is an interesting situation. So I'm not saying that we won't ever have opportunities to have that anxiety. What I'm talking about more is that as we're in these situations, that yes, we may have that, but processing it and not necessarily, there are ways to help support it, not necessarily just manage it, but also decrease it. And over time, learn those tools and even have the healing that is not the high anxiety. But we have ebb and flow in life. So when new trauma events happen, then we may be going through that. So I'm not someone saying, okay, completely, it's going to be eradicated. It's more being mindful of what are things that may impact you. And there are situations like death or other things that might make us, start to be like, oh my gosh, it's getting healing of those emotions to reduce the anxiety in different situations.
I heard about... Sorry, this is not a question. I heard there was a study done after 9/11 on women that gave birth 9 months after that, and I think they found that the children had a high level of anxiety as a result of that. So that's so that can happen.
The high stress and this traumatic. And a lot of times people may not have. Back then, there may have been some training on post-traumatic stress disorder or the trauma, but there may not have been as much because it's when you have worldwide events or even, James, things like that, where it impacts the world or the whole country, it's a lot because everybody's dealing with some level of trauma. And even if you're trauma informed, even for myself, there's still things that I have to be mindful of to take care of myself because there's still things that you have to process, even as a person who helps people or, is in education, that none of us are exempt from having to deal with or process different types of trauma, hence the current pandemic. Everybody has had some form of coping or understanding what that looks like and how it's impacted them.
No one's immune to it. My next question is, what can happen when they are not being treated?
So when we're not treating trauma for people?
Yeah. Like say I had severe complex trauma and I'm not doing anything about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually, that was a lot of my story. I had a lot of complex trauma, just different things from childhood trauma, emotional abuse traumas, bullying, you name it. I've gone through it. And I never got help. And I think even in my family, there was times where there was perhaps generational, like we didn't know how to get help or it's embarrassing or no, it's just deal with it in your family. And I think what happened for me is even when I had a few teachers notice or have concern for me, it was like, I'm good. I'm okay. And so I just dealt with this most of my life on my own. You know, there's externalized times where people actually, you know, might act out with anger and fighting. And then there's internalized, which I think they're both can be harmful, but externalized, you're at least trying to get it out. Whereas internalized, you're taking it all in. And that can be very painful and a lot of emotional pain. So it was almost like instead of putting arrows out, I was putting arrows in. And the arrows in really impacted my psyche. It impacted my belief system, how I took care of myself, how I even interacted with other people. And that was a silence thing most of my life until I started to have a healing journey, which I really believe happened in my late teens, going to college. And I left my house and I learned I was really dealing with it's so different when you come out of a dysfunctional place and you're learning that that doesn't happen in other sectors and other places. And then I spent a lot of my journey going in and out of different addictions, different, just different behaviors because I didn't. I call it a certain thing, which I'll share at some point because I definitely am going to be writing a book on it. But basically, I was responding out of what I only knew, out of dysfunctional identity. And I think a lot of us do that. Like to find ourselves, it's almost like you end up with something, and then all of a sudden you come back to who you really are later. And sometimes in the middle, we're like thinking that's who we are, but it's really not until we get to
yeah.
And so, basically when you're asking about that, I think it really impacts our whole walk. And so it does take time to really overcome, do that. And complex trauma, when you're doing healing with it and how it impacts us is that if we don't get the support, it just continues to build. So additional events and different experiences happen. And if we never dealt with it, imagine how the mind might be with its distortion, perception. And a lot of times when you have adults, they're getting to a place of breakdown or mental breakdown because our body and our mind can only be disconnected so long before we know there's an alert. Our body starts to say, alert. I'm like reliving this and the brain shut down. So it's saying, nope, we don't need to deal with it. And so at some point, we have there's no other choice, but the body's saying it's kind of do that. And some people never do, but there's definitely impact because you see like their negative talk, their anger, you see it in their high levels of that mental health. And it's because a lot of things hadn't been dealt with.
And do you think, when trauma happens, you said, so obviously you're either projecting it to other people or you're swallowing the event. And when you're projecting it to other people, we often think that it's the people around you that are doing it to you.
Yes. And a lot, absolutely. Like when the projection, it can be that you think, or you hear something, because sometimes the tone or even a person that reminds you of somebody that may have been someone that has violated you, all of a sudden you don't realize why your body's upset or why you're angry.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times it could be unconscious. So I always call it unconscious, or some people say subconscious memories that are coming up, or it could be that somebody says something impacts the emotions that have not been dealt with, or a pain point for you, something that you're wanting to change, but you haven't. And so your heart is just like, it's almost like hope deferred. I call it, where the heart gets sick when we have hope and we want to change, but we don't know how. And we know there's something different. Yeah. We accept where we're at. And then we get pain. There's pain when other people aren't accepting where they're at.
Yeah. So, yeah. Brilliant. My next question is, what are some of the impact of disassociation? Some of the impact disassociation can have?
Yes, and dissociation can be where people almost use that. It could be something most easiest described is when you want to be present, but you're not, because the current present situation reminds you of something in the past that's too painful. So it's almost like you're out of body experience. For example, some people might say with dissociation, you are driving, all of a sudden you're driving, you start you go somewhere else, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't know how I got to the town across from one point to another. How did that that happen because we're just almost in a place of not being present. And that happens for people in minute, even if they haven't had trauma, to people who've had complex trauma, where it's really difficult to be grounded and stay in one place because our brain is trying to keep safe. So the keep safe, we dissociate, right? We could not necessarily in the actual moment, and then we come back at some point. And so with dissociation, James, and again, sorry, can you like repeat that last part of the question? Because I wanted to explain first the dissociation.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So what are some of the impact dissociation can have? So.
Thank you. Yeah, so just with explaining dissociation impact is if you are at your job or say you're in a conversation and something happens, you may not be listening, or you might miss important key details. If you're in school, if you're in relationships, it may also be that people think you're emotionally shut down. If you're in a friendships or even, relationships.
Yeah.
That you're not really there. So you're not really fully showing up as who you could be with the person that you're supposed to be with, your friends, and it can impact your social relationships. It can impact your daily job. And depending how often you dissociate, it may be that it warrants additional support, such as therapy, counseling, even going, sometimes there's inpatient or outpatient hospitalization, again, depending on how much that's impacting. And I'm saying, like, if you're dissociating quite a bit where you're not feeling present most of the time, that can be concerning, because then you may not be remembering what you're doing, right? Or you might not be remembering the acts, or sometimes because we're in our trauma, we're in the responding because of our trauma. What happens is we may not even realize we're dissociating throughout an event. For example, if you think of people who have been, domestic violence, or you think of people who are unfortunately in a very sexually assaulted a lot because of the relationships they're in, they dissociate during it, or even during that whole thing. And so I think when we don't realize how much that impacts people, because they basically become almost like not there because it's too painful that they're going through this ongoing violation. And so dissociation can be very alarming, because people are dissociating from themselves because they're being violated, and it can be very painful, to dissociating where it could be you're driving and it could be not healthy to be driving and
No.
quite a bit,
Yeah.
or other things. So it could definitely be harmful to yourself or others. And if it's happening quite a bit, it definitely is something that people may or may not realize, but it is important to seek help from, and it's not embarrassing to get help. It's okay.
With dissociation that happens in childhood, where the event is, we say, any sort of abuse to a child, where they learn to dissociate. Now, obviously, you don't know what you're dissociating. Your brain is just keeping your mind off what's happening. So when you get to your adult life, and you are still dissociating from relationships, but you don't know what you're doing it. Yeah, like you could be talking to someone and they'll be like, "Are you even here?" Yeah, it's like, where did you go? But when it's happening in adulthood, you still don't know why it's happening.
Yeah.
How can you? I'm just thinking for myself. Like, I'm thinking, when did I dissociate from event? A lot of times. No, but like in adult life, if you don't know why you're doing it, is that something like you probably have to seek help for?
Yeah, and sometimes there might other people might notice, and then they're concerned, because sometimes we don't realize how much we're doing that and how it's impacting us. And also, because I remember, for example, for me, there was a time when I was younger, it was probably like 10 years ago, a decade ago, and I was going on a trip, and before I went, I was in a state which I would actually say was the same state when I was 12. There was some type of cycle that happened at that age where I was in that same place. And in that cycle, my family actually, who there was still a dysfunction, they were concerned, because it was like I said, I have a poem where I wrote about this. It was like I was there, but I really wasn't. And that was very true, that I didn't recognize. I knew like I was feeling like numb, and like nothing was, like I was just in a like horrible place. So sometimes we may recognize it, but other people may, and then we may not even know how much we aren't there. And I think obviously today I'm like night and day from where I was, and I'm grateful because of all the deep work I've done. But sometimes we don't realize how much we're doing that. But once you do, like if you constantly like, oh, like I was daydreaming for an hour, what happened? Like, or the time passed. And so
Yeah.
we get those little pieces, but I think the biggest thing is getting help, whether you're a man or woman. I think there's a lot still stigma where people still, or like, we're like, I don't need help, because depending on the generation now, a lot more people are advocating for mental health.
Yeah.
There's a lot of generations, like my older grandparents and family, they were taught to be quiet and don't say anything. So you have this continuum of people now saying, speak about it, and people saying, no, just get over it, because that's what they were taught. And it really is confusing to a lot of people, because there are different, because of what we were taught. And now it's like, it's time to uncover it, but it's painful because a lot of people haven't, because that's what they were told not to do. And so I think that's also a part of it, is that people may realize, again, depending if they have different I feel like there's fragments of people, like we have to, I believe in integration of the brain, and it's possible, and I've seen it, including myself. But I think like it takes some time to say, I need help, and actually get help, and that it's actually strong to get help. You don't have to try to do it on your own. And so many people feel like they need to, but that's where you have people break down, because we're called to help each other, and all of us deal with some type of, we all have a brain, we all have thinking, and all of us need each other to say, hey, how you doing? Because none of us are exempt, as you said, or immune to not having to be mindful of what we put in our brain or what we're thinking. And we need each other to say, oh, okay, I was dealing with that once too. Or yeah, I dealt with that sometimes. Sometimes that comes up and I can relate to you. Because I think that's what people think, is that they say something and people think they're crazy because we've made it such a stigma. When,
Yeah, I think the society viewpoint still affects a lot of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so my next question is, what are some of the consequences of emotional detachment with parents?
Yeah, emotional detachment with parents, and parents may not realize that they have different attachment or detachment styles happening. There are things such as attachment styles like avoidant attachment, or just dismissive avoidant attachment. And then there's secure attachment, which is healthy, where we have our parents, where they are present, they have had healing. There's not something where there's codependency, where they're present with us. They express emotions. Like, we talk about things. It's not where a parent shuts down on us, or a parent ignores our emotions, or we feel rejected or abandoned, or if we are, because we're humans. None of us are going to be perfect in this. We're humans, right? But it's a secure attachment when it's not overly, where parents are overly trying to please, meaning that they're doing so much for us. And it's not where a parent's not there emotionally. I'm so glad my dad was a provider, and I honor him. He did what he could, but he didn't have the emotions there. So where he was providing, I needed the emotional dad to be there for different events, not just to work, for example. And so I didn't have that healthy attachment with my dad, because there wasn't the emotional attachment. There were some things, but my dad didn't quite know how to do that because he didn't have it, for example. And for my mom, there was more of the overly, right? Constant fear, the fear of me being hurt, which I didn't love either, because I wanted to, there's always this, oh, you can't do this because it'll be scary. So I grew up in this very confusing, fearful, yet dismissive emotions. And I think what happens then is that you didn't, it took time to have secure attachment within, that I have safety within, and that I can learn how to have healthy relationships. But definitely, if there's detachment, it can impact the child's relationships with themselves, how they love them, and also how they have relationships and friendships with other people. Do they run away from relationships? Do they stay? Do they try to sabotage relationships? Do they feel worthy? And so depending on those lack of attachments, you have people trying to be too independent or too dependent on another person, and not really knowing who they are.
And in terms, with parents, so you could be giving your child everything, but if you're not emotionally there with them, obviously they would enjoy what you're giving them. If you're not emotionally there with them, they will eventually start feeling it.
Yeah, it'll impact them because they truly want, all of us want to belong and be accepted. A lot of our pain, or even with other relationships, it always goes back to mom and dad, either like a mother or a father wound. And I say that because not everybody believes that, but I do, because I feel like, if we have that there in the events, a lot of it is however we perceive the world is a lot of times for our mom and dad. So if we don't have that healthy relationship, and healing takes a journey, then we may view other people, or like say we have like a painful thing with our mom, or like there was overbearing stuff, then we might view other people like that, or like, depending on the person. So it's, or dad. So I think it does definitely impact us and our relationships. And then as we realize what we're operating in and the functions that we learned, it's that undoing, which takes time to undo and realize that was just a response we learned, but it's not really the healthy response that we can give.
And do you think when it comes to your adult relationship, you're more likely to seek someone that's distant from you as well? Well, yeah.
That's a great question. So I think and for myself, I can speak to most of my life, when I was operating out of this different function because of the unhealthy functions, I would seek people unknowingly most of the time that had that detachment, where I was trying to seek them out and be like, oh man, like they're emotionally unavailable, but this can change, or like trying so hard to be loved, or like not be abandoned and rejected from these people. And each time I was in these relationships, it was another arrow to me, because it was taking away from my self-worth, to a point where I was almost begging people to love me or think I'm valuable and worthy, because I didn't know what that was like inside. And I felt like that's what I had to do because it was modeled to me, and so as I healed, I learned, okay, that was not healthy. I have to love myself. And something really insightful I had a long time ago was during one really hard time in my life. Now, this is just from relationship parts, because I realized that a man who doesn't love and value himself will not recognize the person that is in front of them, and a woman who's not in knowing her worth and value and love in life will not recognize the man. It's just something that happens where if not, there's going to be other people that may seem like, oh, they're safe because like they have very similar things, but they haven't dealt with it. So I think that in the journey of life, we may have different relationships that kind of mirrors where we are. And sometimes, as we continue to evolve, hopefully we're in the right place with someone who wants to keep evolving too. But I find that a lot of times in the past, my relationships mirrored where I was or where they were too. And some of those things, I call it like a trauma bond, where people have, and that if you really think about it, James, this is a whole other topic, which I will do. But
trauma bond is like,
but it's like, but what the wild thing is that most people, if you have never done healing, a lot of people are in relationships that I call trauma bonded. They're not really actually the person that would be like, the person that would really soar them ahead. It's a trauma bond. It's actually, and they feel like it's such a deep connection, but it's really a wounded connection.
True. That was actually what I was going to ask because at the start, when you meet someone, it's like, oh my God, this is so great. And over time, they're no longer feeling that gap that you actually want. Mm-hmm. So it was the trauma that brought you guys together, because you recognize unconsciously what you're familiar with. So that's a whole conversation on itself.
I know, third one.
Especially when you're talking about relationships, because no one wants to believe that.
Right.
Yeah. So my next question is, what are some of the signs of being abandoned?
Abandonment, that is a painful one, because abandonment can actually be in the womb. If you have a parent that doesn't really want you, they don't realize that it impacts you. And abandonment, some of those impacts could be codependency, where we stay in friendships or relationships that we're afraid that people will leave. So we try to over people please. We try to, it's almost fawning response where we're like, okay, I'll do whatever. Just don't leave me. We have a lot of fears. It can impact us in that we're afraid to even change. Like change is very scary where we don't want to change relationships or even jobs. And abandonment can lead to a lot of anxiety, depression, and just us changing or not being who we really are and showing up as ourselves because we're so afraid of abandonment. It can lead to really unhealthy relationships. It can lead to unhealthy addictions because really at the root of it, we just don't want to be abandoned. And it also can be that a lot of people who are high achievers actually posted yesterday that a lot of times the fear of abandonment is that we don't want people to abandon us. So we high perform and we overperform because we want people to see that we want to get validated so that we're not abandoned in being smart or good enough. Those are some big ones.
When you think of abandonment, sorry, oh my God, let me have my water, sorry.
Sure, no worries. I should get water.
When you think of abandonment, you always associate it with someone leaving, for example. Can you still be abandoned in a family where the two parents are still there as a child?
Yeah, so abandonment can be, going back to that emotional detachment, where we feel abandoned and unloved even in our family. Maybe there's lack of that emotional presence, physical presence in our family. Perhaps in a family that's together, you can have abandonment feeling or perception. And you can also, if you have families that are single families or there's divorce or there's separation, there can still be. I remember even with some of my clients, they are like, oh, I remember the day that my dad left, even if it was just for a few days. I remember that day and he left me. I thought he left me and my family. And so we can actually perceive or believe that we're abandoned from events that happen. So certainly, whether it be in an actual family, James, that there are family members, but if there's something happened like a fight or whatnot, which things happen, it can impact us where we think that we might be abandoned or we remember those experiences and they're almost locked in us, and it might come up later. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the root of it. That was when it happened, age 1.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how we don't recognize that impacts us.
Yeah. Brilliant. And my last question for this is okay, this is quite a long one, so just give me a second, sorry. Okay, how should an adult who was emotionally neglected as a child overcome the voice in the head that says, these people don't know me, or these people will never understand me? So this is where you have a lot of trauma. You want to speak to people, but in your mind, you're thinking, they're not going to understand what I'm saying. So how do you overcome that voice?
That's a great question to unpack. And it is.
It is. That's why I left it to last. So, and we just get an overview of it.
Yep. The first thing is that anytime we have things inside of us and it's protected, we don't feel safe. The first way to realize that it's okay to talk is if we feel emotional safety with the person we're talking with. And so it might take some time for a person to establish safety, because before we can heal, we must feel safe. That's really the beginning part of it. So I would say once we use our voice, which is the scariest part sometimes because we're told to be quiet or not talk about it, or that no one's going to help. And the first part is saying, if we have a safe person, even someone that we know, and our barriers come down a little bit, and we can say, I can talk to this person, I can share this, and it's the first step. And so that safety part, though, really is regulation. So sometimes when we're in it, it is like before we even have a relationship, it is our brain relaxing enough to know we're safe. And so, yes, there's regulation like water and whatnot, but a lot of times it may just be that for some of you even listening, that you've had so much trauma and disappointment that it may just take some time to realize someone's safe, and to also know that it's okay. And once you start speaking it, there's power in our words. So once you start speaking it, it's the first step of saying, okay, this person is safe enough and I need help. And if I don't reach out to anybody, I may not be safe for myself. And I think that's one of the biggest things to realize is that at some point, we're not even safe to ourselves because we're not trusting anyone, including even ourselves. And so I think the biggest thing is, who is your safest person? And if you don't have a safe person, there are different helplines, especially like if you're one that's like really dealing with mental health or thinking, and it's just not, there's ongoing racing thoughts. There are mental health support systems where you may not know them, but at least you can share it with somebody and at least get going with your voice. And then they might share with you, but little by little, even if you just call that first to get you going, and then certainly reaching out. Again, there are people, usually counselors can be safe, but I always say you can check in, so you get to know people, but you want to have a safe person to share, hey, I'm not sure how I'm doing, and then they can support you. But when you share, and if there are things that are really going on with you, know that people care about you. So if there are things like you're having high suicide thoughts or other things, that if you're not feeling safe, the first priority is always you. Is always you making sure you get help. Now, if it's something in your head where you're like, well, I can't do this, I can't trust a person, definitely one of the big things with safety is like our body has to feel safe. But I would say whoever is your safest person, everybody needs a safe person. And sometimes we don't feel like we have one. So my hope is either call a hotline first to help you, and then also look at who is a safe person, whether it be a mentor, whether it be a colleague or a friend, somebody that you think of right away that is safe, or even if they're not in your family, because sometimes we don't have safe family. Identifying them and being able to reach out, because you matter, because and what you're thinking does matter, and then that will help you with the next step, which is healing. So safety of talking to someone and then getting your healing. I hope that helps. If anything else you need clarified, I can do that.
And I suppose when you start to talk to someone, your emotions will tell you whether you trust them or not. Like if I'm going to start talking to you, which is what we're already talking about, but there's something holding me back. Just like, no, don't do it. Mm-hmm. That's probably a good sign, isn't it? If your emotions just like, no. And then you meet some people that you're just like, oh, I can just talk to this person.
Yeah. I think I think there's twofold. I think sometimes we can come to somebody and we realize they're safe. And there's something about them that we're like, okay, they're drawn in, they may have done their healing work. There's something that they're safe with. Another part is like, if we have people that remind us of people in our past, even if they may be safe, we may perceive them not to be safe in the moment because of what's going on with us. That is a possibility. And then there are things like you said, where yes, like if you get to somebody and you don't feel safe, because there's something going on with them and you can tell like they may not be a safe person. That's another possibility. I think there's a ebb and flow. I think for sometimes if we really truly are so feeling not safe, sometimes we may think somebody's safe. So I think perception can be just distorted, either thinking someone's safe or not safe based on what happens, based on our past that we've healed, or based on other stuff. Because you could have a safe person, they say one thing, and all of a sudden you don't think they're safe. And it's not that they're not, right? Like there's something, or maybe like we're in a perception of the challenge distortion, and that person shared something, but it kind of impacted us. We're like, ooh, that really was painful. But they didn't mean it, but it was something that we needed to hear, but we're not ready to hear. That can also be painful because we think that they're not safe. And a lot of times, sometimes we hear things that we're not ready to hear. And I've done that in my life where I've had people say things to me I wasn't ready to hear, and it was painful, and I was like, they're not safe, but they were. And there were times in my life that I said something to people and they deemed me not safe because I was saying something they weren't ready to hear, because they still weren't at that place to say, yeah, this is absolutely something that needs to change. And again, my wisdom now is I know when to say it or when not. And sometimes even because I'm in I'm going to be getting my master's soon in counseling. I have my doctorate in education, and being through it myself, there are times where, there's times where like there's challenging thoughts, but you have that relationship with people. So, if I met somebody for the first time, it's not like I'm be like, oh, let me challenge everything you're saying. Right?
Yeah.
It would be that you want to establish that you care. And I hear people, I validate people, even if they are in the middle of dissociation. We want to validate people because that's where they're at right now. So I validate people where they are, and establish that I hear them, and that what they are saying matters, that I'm not like, oh man, I'm hearing them and I want them to know that I'm a safe place, that they can share anything with me. And as we grow in time and relationship, you know, there may be times where there might be okay, like you're saying this, you know, and can you see how that might be impacting your relationship? But those are times where you have that safety, you have that support. And when you're sharing that, you're not saying negative things to them. You're helping them think about what they're thinking about and see, okay, how is that impacting you? Is that helping? Is that hindering? And it helps them to perhaps think about that themselves.
Fantastic. Sorry, that was a big question.
Yeah, it was a great question. I loved it.
There's a lot in that, especially when it comes to sharing your story with people. Like that someone might say something.
Yeah.
It might be perceived as mean, but it might just mean also you're not ready to hear it.
Yeah.
Which happens quite a lot. So great. That's all the questions I had for our Q&A. Yeah.
That's great.
all the professional questions anyway. Yeah. My last question is, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Ooh, that's so, yeah.
That's not a professional question.
I actually think it's part of it because that's part of self-esteem. So and it's interesting. So I love being outside. I love to work out. I love to cook. I love to go out with friends, and the beach is fun. And whenever I can, I love writing, which is funny, but I really enjoy spending time with people, quality time, and just being outside. I mean, the sun is my thing. And so on rainy days, I can handle it. So for me, being outside with friends, going out for salsa or, you know, dancing, or singing, or anything that can get me laughing, because I can really get into some things. I can be very focused, but I think we all have a childlike nature. So being outside or being out is something I enjoy. So yeah, walking, running, spending time with people are things I do for fun, and traveling. Every time I can travel, James, I do. So
yeah,
definitely part of my life.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm just okay. Sorry. Oh my God. Sorry. I have to bring my mind back here. It's like, we're okay, calm down. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Ask the Therapist. Today I'm joined by Amanda, who's an author, an educator, consultant, and also an international conference speaker. And today we're going to be, oh my God, I was doing so well. So I have to start again.
That's okay. You're all good. No worries. You take whatever you need.
Once I get past that part, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, the rest of the conversation will just flow through. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Ask the Therapist. Today I'm done. This is like the clips that they show you at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw some of your fun things.
All the mistakes. Okay. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a quick review on my Facebook page, Don't Be Afraid to Talk, or DM me on Instagram. The show notes will include all of the relevant links from today's episode. If you haven't already, please download, leave a rating, and share with your friends. You might just reach that person who needs to hear this message. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. I am James Lumumba, signing off with gratitude.